They laughed the moment she stepped on stage, because her skin was black and her stepfather wore a janitor's uniform. And in that instant, the entire auditorium decided she was nothing. No one knew who he really was. No one cared. They just saw the color of her skin, the way her clothes didn't match theirs, and the silence she carried like shame, and they twisted it into a punchline. What followed wasn't just bullying. It was a carefully constructed campaign of humiliation. But behind the silence, behind every cruel whisper and smirk, was a truth that none of them saw coming. A truth that would make every student who mocked her wish they had never opened their mouths. If you're here for stories that go deeper than the surface, that peel back the masks and expose what's really underneath, hit like, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what do you think the real story is? You might think you know what this is about. Marissa Hollins always arrived at school early. It wasn't because she loved learning or had a deep passion for academics. It was about strategy. Getting there before the crowds meant she didn't have to navigate the narrow gauntlet of glances, whispers, or smirks that started populating the halls the closer it got to first bell. In those brief, quiet moments when the fluorescent lights buzzed against silence, she could move unnoticed. No eyes tracking her, no shoulders brushing her backpack with intentional carelessness. On this particular morning, she walked into Kennedy Heights High through the side entrance near the science wing. Her fingers were cold from a walk, her coat zipped to the chin, and her breath formed faint clouds that dissipated before anyone could see them. She pulled her locker combination from memory, humming a melody under her breath, something she'd practiced the night before on the cello. The moment her locker door opened, the stench hit her. Her nose wrinkled, and her lungs hesitated. Something sour, pungent, unmistakably chemical spilled from the narrow metal space. Inside was a pile of old rags soaked in ammonia. Wet patches darkened the bottom of the locker and leaked slightly onto the floor. Tucked neatly on top of the rags was a torn sheet of lined notebook paper with a single word scrawled across it in black marker: janitor. Her eyes locked onto the word for a long moment. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't reach for help. She simply closed the locker again, quietly pulled her scarf up over her nose, and turned away. The hall remained empty. No witnesses, no evidence. Just her and the silence that now followed her more loyally than any friend ever had. The day continued. By the time she reached her first period classroom, the seats were mostly full. She slid into her usual desk near the back. As she reached for her pen, her hand paused midair. The surface of her desk had been coated with something slick and shiny. Grease. Cooking oil maybe, or something worse. Her sleeve brushed it and immediately soaked the smell in. She looked down at the stain spreading across her arm and slowly set her backpack down beside her. No one looked in her direction. Mr. Connors, at the front of the room, didn't notice. Students tapped their phones, whispered about homework, adjusted earbuds, and went on with their morning rituals. She didn't speak, didn't ask for a paper towel. She folded her arms across her lap and sat still, the smell clinging to her skin. In third period, the discomfort continued. When she entered the computer lab, her assigned chair had been moved. A sticky note sat where the seat had been, stuck onto the table with clear tape. It read reserved for facilities. Her name had been replaced with a blank line. The substitute teacher that day shrugged when she asked about the seating change, told her to find an open spot. None remained. Marissa stood against the wall for the entire class. Her arms began to ache halfway through, but she stayed quiet. After all, raising her voice wouldn't change a thing. By lunchtime, her appetite was long gone, but her stomach still ached with hunger. She entered the cafeteria and headed to her usual spot in the far corner. The same half table, always half empty. She unpacked her lunch, half a sandwich, an apple, a thermos of water, and noticed immediately that something was wrong. The sandwich bag had been opened and re-wrapped poorly. The bread was smashed, the peanut butter smeared along the plastic. She lifted the thermos and felt liquid slosh, but the lid was slightly loose. She unscrewed it cautiously, and the sharp smell of vinegar hit her nose. Someone had poured vinegar into her water. The apple had been bitten once. A single bite mark, still brown around the edge. She looked around slowly, but no one watched her. Everyone acted as if nothing had happened, as if this was just another lunch period, just another day. She repacked her bag, stood, and left the cafeteria without eating. In sixth period, the biology teacher called on her to pass out worksheets. When she stood up, 2 folded paper towels fell from under her chair. She bent to pick them up and saw what was written. One said lunch lady's daughter. The other read sanitation royalty. Her face burned, but she said nothing. She tossed them into the trash without a word and continued passing out the worksheets. That afternoon, she stopped by the music wing, her private sanctuary, the only place she ever felt entirely herself. She didn't have a cello of her own, but Mr. Roman had let her use one of the school's instruments for practice. She moved to the storage room, unlocked the old case, and froze. Inside, the cello strings had been slashed, deliberately, with deep gouges into the wood where the bridge once sat. The bow had been snapped at the grip, laid neatly across the instrument like a mock funeral arrangement. White powder had been poured into the hollow body, chalk dust, fine and messy, coating everything inside. It settled into the grain, turned the deep walnut color of the wood pale and sickly. Her breath caught, but she didn't make a sound. She closed the case slowly, locked it, and placed it back onto the shelf. At home, she didn't say much. Her mother asked if she had a good day. Marissa smiled and nodded. Her mother worked nights at the urgent care clinic and looked too tired to carry anything extra. The halls were already buzzing, and she could feel the difference right away. Heads turned when she passed. Not dramatically, not enough to draw attention to themselves, but just enough for her to feel it. The stares were different now, not just curious, but loaded with something that made her skin itch. Her locker was untouched this time. That alone should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt like the quiet before a storm. She went through her morning classes without incident. Teachers lectured, students murmured, and her chair remained clean. But the unease followed her like a second shadow. It wasn't until fourth period, between classes, that she saw it. The hallway outside the library had a bulletin board where students could post club updates, birthday shout-outs, and sports photos. She rarely glanced at it, but today her name caught her eye. Or rather, her image did. Someone had pinned a large sheet of printer paper right in the center of the board. It showed a black and white caricature drawing, crude but recognizable. A girl with a braid, slumped shoulders, and oversized glasses stood next to a short, hunched man in overalls, holding a mop. Beneath the image, in block letters, it read, "Bloodline of Bleach." She stared at it for a long second, heart thudding, before stepping forward to rip it down. As her fingers touched the paper, 2 voices behind her laughed, soft and low. She didn't turn. She didn't want to know who they were. She didn't need names. She already had faces burned into memory. She tore the paper clean from the board, crumpled it once, and slipped it into her jacket pocket. As she turned to leave, she noticed something else. Around the corners of the bulletin board, smaller slips had been stapled in clusters. At first glance, they looked like flyers for lost items or tutoring services. But on closer inspection, each bore a short phrase, typed in narrow font, all saying variations of the same thing. Scrub well, Hollins. Trash doesn't clean itself. Uniforms fit better when earned. Words meant to linger and rot. She pulled down everyone she could reach and walked straight to her next class without looking back. Her hand stayed clenched in her coat pocket the entire time. Later that day, in gym class, things escalated again. The locker room smelled like sweat and disinfectant, a scent that Marissa had never liked but learned to accept. As she changed into her gym uniform, she noticed the silence. Usually, the girls talked about parties, dates, teachers, gossip, but today there was nothing, just the sound of sneakers on tile and zippers being pulled. As she pulled her shirt over her head, she heard a soft snort from the back corner. A few girls were huddled near the mirror, pretending to fix their hair. When she stepped out of the locker room onto the gym floor, she understood why. Someone had written across her assigned gym bench in thick black marker, "Reserved for staff daughters." The ink was bold and ugly, stretched across the wooden surface like a scar. Coach Bell was at the far end of the gym, half distracted by a clipboard. Marissa stood frozen for a second, unsure whether to sit or walk away. Then she quietly stepped around the bench and stood along the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her stomach. No one said anything to her. Not Coach Bell, not the other students. But she could feel their smirks like heat rising off asphalt. The rest of the class passed in a blur of whistles, squeaking shoes, and hollow laughter. Marissa never moved from her place. After gym, the final insult of the day came without warning. As she returned to her locker at the end of 7th period, a folded flyer was sticking out from the vents. She pulled it out and unfolded it with numb fingers. The paper was printed in full color. It showed a mock advertisement for the school's upcoming Spirit Week. Only this version was unofficial. At the bottom, a new day had been added. Custodian Appreciation Thursday, dress like you're related. Beneath it was a drawing. Her again, this time in an exaggerated janitor's uniform, pushing a broom half her size. Her real name wasn't printed, but it didn't have to be. The braid, the glasses, the posture, it was unmistakably her. She folded the flyer with slow precision and placed it into her backpack. As the bell rang and students flooded the halls, she moved against the current like a stone in the riverbed. She dressed with care, tying her braid tighter than usual, choosing a long-sleeve top to cover the faint oil stains that hadn't come out of her other shirt. She packed her lunch herself, double-checking every zipper and compartment. She left the house quietly, letting her mother sleep in and Daniel sip his coffee in silence. She didn't want them to know how bad things had become. Not yet. Not when they worked so hard to keep her world steady. The streets outside were gray and quiet, the air heavy with moisture, the sky low and flat like a lid waiting to fall. By the time she reached the school gates, the hum of fluorescent lights and student voices had already begun to rise. She kept her pace even and her eyes forward. Her locker stood closed, a small victory, but when she opened it, a sour wave of vinegar greeted her again. Her sandwich bag had been tampered with. The sandwich was gone, replaced by a slice of white bread smeared with an unidentifiable brown paste. She removed it without hesitation, dropped it into the trash bin, and zipped her bag shut. She didn't react. She didn't pause. She simply walked to homeroom. Her desk was clean today, but a slip of paper sat folded in the upper corner. She unfolded it. The message was typed this time, printed with bold sans serif letters on thin gray paper. It read, "Dirt can't hide behind manners forever." She folded it twice and tucked it into her sleeve. First period passed without incident, but the absence of cruelty felt like bait. She kept scanning her surroundings, waiting for the next strike. It came just before third period. The yearbook staff had set up a booth in the main hallway to advertise senior photo submissions and club portraits. Banners hung from the ceiling and colored posters lined the tables. Marissa didn't think anything of it until she saw her own name. Not on the roster, not on any list, but on a printed page, displayed near the table for everyone to see. Her name had been typed beneath a photo labeled Custodial Services Club, a group that didn't exist. The picture was edited crudely, but the face was hers. Her body was dressed in a utility jumpsuit, mop in one hand, and a trash bin behind her. The photo was framed by fake quotes supposedly attributed to her. One read, "I'm not ashamed of where I come from." The other said, "My stepdad taught me that real success comes with bleach." She stared at it, heart pounding in her chest, unsure what shocked her more, the image or the fact that no one around her seemed to care. Two boys snickered as they passed. One pointed, the other elbowed his friend. No one stopped to question if it was real. The person behind the booth, a student named Alexis who ran the yearbook committee, avoided her gaze when she approached. Marissa didn't say a word. She pulled the paper down, folded it in four, and slid it into her coat pocket. Alexis mumbled something, but Marissa had already walked away. During lunch, she avoided the cafeteria entirely. She sat in the library instead, back to the wall, a book open on her lap, though she didn't read a single line. Her appetite had disappeared again. Even with her packed lunch untouched, her stomach was too tight to eat. She looked up every time the library doors opened. Part of her expected more notes to appear, more whispering, another attack. None came. The silence was worse than noise. She returned to class with her shoulders tight, braced for the next blow. It arrived in fifth period during group presentations for U.S. history. Each student had been assigned a historical figure. Marissa had been given Harriet Tubman. She had worked hard on her slideshow, careful to include maps, images, quotes, and statistics about the Underground Railroad. She had even rehearsed her lines 3 times the night before. When her name was called, she stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. The projector flickered. Her slides loaded. But the first image on the screen wasn't hers. Instead of Tubman's portrait, a cartoon figure appeared, black hunched, holding a mop and broom in each hand, with exaggerated lips and wide eyes. The title slide read, "Housekeeping Heroines." The class erupted into snickering. One student laughed out loud. The teacher, Mr. Walsh, rushed to the laptop, clicking keys in confusion. He muttered something about files being switched or corrupted. Marissa didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply waited. After 30 seconds, her correct file reappeared. Mr. Walsh cleared his throat and told her to begin. She did. Her voice didn't shake. She finished the entire presentation without looking up once. What had started as taunts from a handful of students had evolved into a shared language, a code passed around with nods, smirks, and whispers that never had to be spoken out loud. It was in the way people moved when she walked by, the way they shifted just slightly to make her squeeze past, the way a word like clean or mop lingered in the air long after she'd left a hallway. The cruelty had become invisible, and that made it harder to fight. She reached her locker, and for a brief second, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the dial. It was clean yesterday, untouched, but that didn't mean it would be today. When she opened it, she found her books where she had left them, but something else had been placed on top of her algebra notebook. It was a small plastic container filled with cotton balls. On top of them, someone had arranged thin rubber gloves and a folded hairnet, the kind used by cafeteria workers. A yellow sticky note on the lid read, "For when you start your shift." Her chest tightened. She didn't touch the container. She simply removed her notebook from beneath it and closed the door. A group of juniors standing near the water fountain burst into quiet laughter. One of them glanced at her and quickly looked away. She walked past them without breaking stride. In second period, she found her seat already occupied. She stood beside it for a moment, waiting, thinking maybe the student sitting there hadn't noticed. But Carter Nelson didn't move. He leaned back, arms crossed over his chest, legs stretched wide, and looked at her with a smile that said everything. She didn't ask him to move. She turned and walked to the only empty seat near the window, in the front row where everyone could see her. As she sat down, she noticed the words scrawled faintly in pencil along the wooden edge of the desk. "Marissa cleans up well." It was barely legible, but she recognized the writing. It matched a note she had collected days earlier. Her fingers curled around her pen as the teacher began the lecture. By lunchtime, the whisper network had grown stronger. When she entered the cafeteria, conversations paused for a beat before resuming. No one made eye contact, but everyone seemed aware of her presence. Her usual spot near the wall was taken, so she sat at a table by the window where no one else had gathered. She unpacked her lunch carefully, inspecting everything twice. The sandwich was intact. The apple was untouched. But when she unscrewed the cap of her water bottle, a sharp, metallic scent filled the air. Bleach. Not a strong dose, but enough to sting her nose and throat. She sealed it quickly, slid the bottle back into her bag, and left the cafeteria without a word. On her way out, she passed a group of sophomores laughing over a phone screen. One of them looked up as she passed and mouthed the word "maid." The others tried to hold back their laughter. She spent the rest of her free period in the library pretending to read, but her mind wasn't on the page. She kept thinking about the container in her locker, the words on her desk, the bleach in her bottle. Someone had gone to her locker again. That meant someone had access. And whoever it was felt protected enough not to worry about being caught. That was what frightened her most. It wasn't just students acting alone anymore. Someone higher up had to be helping, or, at the very least, turning a blind eye. That realization settled into her gut like cold iron. They didn't just dislike her. They believed she didn't belong. And worse, they were willing to reshape the entire environment around her to prove it. In fifth period, she noticed the teacher's tone shift when she raised her hand. Mr. Caldwell, who usually called on her without hesitation, ignored her 3 times during the lesson. When she approached him afterward to ask about the next assignment, he spoke in a clipped, dismissive tone and walked away before she finished her question. Students who had once partnered with her for projects now avoided her table. Some even traded seats to ensure they wouldn't be assigned next to her. It wasn't fear. It was contamination, as if being near her would stain their reputations, as if the things whispered about her were true enough to matter. After school, she walked to the music room again, though she knew the cello case remained untouched and useless. Mr. Roman offered her a nod from behind his desk, but said nothing. She sat in the far corner on a folding chair and stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to will herself into stillness. For a while it worked, but then she heard footsteps outside the door. Quiet, purposeful. A few seconds later, someone slid an envelope under the door. She waited until the footsteps faded before picking it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "Even bleach can't scrub away your last name." It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in cursive, neat and careful. She folded it, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked out without looking back. But what unnerved her most wasn't the vandalism or the bleach or the fake flyers. It was the quiet. It was how every teacher who saw her now looked through her, how her name was skipped over in discussion, how even eye contact had become a risk no one wanted to take. That morning, the announcements buzzed through the overhead speaker in homeroom with the usual robotic cheerfulness, listing birthdays, weekend football matches, and then something that made her stomach go still: the list of students selected for recognition at the school's monthly honor assembly. Her name was called last, beneath a line of students known more for charm than grades. The announcement said she would be acknowledged for her academic improvement in math and her contribution to the music department. Her stomach twisted. The cello she once practiced on had been destroyed days ago. The thought that anyone thought she still belonged to that department felt cruel in a different way. But she stayed quiet, lowered her gaze, and accepted the murmur of glances that followed her name. The auditorium was already buzzing by the time she entered, escorted with the others by Ms. Ryland, the assistant principal. The air smelled of dust and deodorant, and the rows of metal chairs groaned under the shuffling of feet and whispered jokes. As the student body filed in, Marissa sat in the second row on the end, away from the others who laughed with each other easily, without a single glance in her direction. She clutched the edges of her seat, trying to steady her breathing. The stage had been decorated with streamers and school banners, and a podium stood in the center beneath a single bright spotlight. Faculty filtered in slowly, taking their places along the sides. The principal, Mr. Ramy, stood off stage talking with a few students from the video club, who were setting up cameras to record the event. The buzz of conversation built as the student host took the stage. Her voice rang clear as she introduced the assembly's theme: hard work and perseverance. Marissa blinked slowly, her hands locked beneath her seat. That word, perseverance, sounded like an insult now. The first few awards were handed out quickly: recognition for perfect attendance, for leadership in sports, for volunteer hours logged at the animal shelter. Applause followed each name. Students grinned, posed for photos, high-fived their friends. The ceremony had the same rhythm as every one before it, but then the host returned to the podium, cleared her throat, and announced the special recognition for music and academic progress. Marissa's name rang out over the microphone. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. She stood and walked toward the stage in a straight line, eyes fixed ahead, hands loose at her sides. The crowd clapped politely. She climbed the stairs slowly. But before she reached the podium, the auditorium lights flickered, then dimmed slightly. A video screen to the right of the stage lit up. At first it showed nothing, just a blank frame. Then music began to play, a low instrumental loop. The screen filled with an edited slideshow of images. But they weren't photos of her playing cello or working on assignments. They were screenshots. Someone had taken stills from the fake flyers, the caricatures, and the custodial memes that had floated around school for days. The screen showed the doctored yearbook image again, her face pasted on a janitor's body. Then another slide appeared, a shot of a mop bucket labeled future equipment. The music swelled. The images changed faster now, her locker, the bleach bottle, the cafeteria note. Each slide timed with a beat. The final image was a picture of a janitor's closet, digitally edited to show a name tag on a hook labeled M. Hollins. The crowd didn't laugh, not loudly, but the sound of scattered snickers cut through the dark like knives. The lights flickered back on. The video stopped. The host at the podium was frozen. Marissa stood center stage, motionless, her face blank, her hand steady. No one moved. No teacher rose. No voice cried out in protest. The silence stretched too long. The assistant principal stepped onto the stage, whispered something to the host, who nodded slowly. They handed Marissa a paper certificate that bore her name and a generic line of commendation. She accepted it with 2 fingers turned and walked off stage without a word. The applause was weak, thin. By the time she returned to her seat, students had begun murmuring again, a few pretending nothing had happened, a few glancing her way before quickly looking down. The rest of the assembly passed in a blur. Names were called. Awards were handed out. But for Marissa, time had slowed. She clutched the certificate in her lap like it meant something, though it felt more like evidence than honor. When the bell rang and students flooded out of the auditorium, she moved quickly, pushing through the crowd until she reached the hallway by the art wing. She ducked into the supply closet, an old, narrow room that hadn't been used in years. Inside, it smelled like dry paper and old paint. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, the certificate crumpled at her side. Her face remained dry. No tears came, only stillness. In that moment, she wasn't humiliated. She wasn't even angry. She was hollow, like something inside had been scooped out and left empty. She stayed there until the halls quieted. When she emerged, the school felt deserted. The ceremony was over. The show had ended. Her part had been played. She walked to her locker, opened it slowly, and found one final message. A new note taped neatly inside, with typed text that read, "You made it to the stage. Don't forget where you come from." She pulled it down, folded it once, and placed it into the folder she carried now in the bottom of her bag. At home that evening, she said little. Her mother was working late again. Daniel was watching the evening news with the volume low. The sea of students and teachers who sat frozen in their seats, unwilling to raise a hand or stop the recording, unwilling to be caught defending her. They had left her alone under the light. They had watched it happen and let the moment die without protest. On Monday morning, the world outside was still gray. The sky was low and colorless, the wind biting at her cheeks as she stepped off the city bus a block from school. She walked slower now, not with fear or hesitation, but with the weight of someone moving through cement. The attacks had changed her posture, but not her path. She still walked forward, still kept her head upright, still entered the building as if it belonged to her. The school felt quieter than usual, and that silence unnerved her more than any laughter ever had. When she stepped into the main corridor, the air shifted, the way it always did when something unseen waited ahead. Her locker was untouched, the outer shell clean, the dial smooth beneath her fingertips. She opened it cautiously, half expecting another stage prop, but there was nothing inside but her belongings. She didn't exhale relief. She didn't trust quiet anymore. In first period, the usual murmur of conversation that preceded the bell was subdued. People were speaking, but their voices were lower, their tones restrained. Something had changed, but she couldn't name it yet. She sat at her desk, back straight, eyes forward. Mr. Barnett started class as usual, calling on students to define economic terms. He passed over her hand twice, as always. But when the third question came and no one volunteered, he pointed at her without looking up. "Marissa," he said flatly, "define monetary policy." Her voice didn't waver. She answered correctly. He nodded and continued the lesson. A few heads turned toward her. A few pairs of eyes lingered longer than they used to. But still no words. No comments. No smirks. Just watching. During second period, the hallway outside her English class had a new decoration. A bulletin board had been rearranged over the weekend, and now featured a collage of student-submitted poems and artwork. She didn't look at it until she passed the third time that morning. In the bottom right corner, someone had pinned a black and white drawing of a custodian's closet door slightly ajar, with light leaking through the crack. Above it, a caption written in fine pen, "Not all doors lead to rooms you choose." Her stomach turned slightly. The artwork was anonymous, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the implication echoed with the same sharpness she'd grown used to. She didn't remove the drawing. She didn't tell the teacher. She simply memorized the image and moved on. By lunch, the mood had shifted again. She walked into the cafeteria expecting to eat alone, as always, but her usual table was already occupied. 3 students she didn't know well sat there, eating silently, eyes down. They didn't react when she approached. They didn't make space or move their trays. She turned and found another spot by the window. Her sandwich was intact. Her water tasted normal. She ate in silence, chewing slowly, her eyes on the far wall, the noise of the room distant and dull like rain on glass. When she stood to leave, a folded note had been left beneath her tray. She hadn't seen anyone place it. She hadn't seen anyone near her. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was different, smoother. It read, "You didn't deserve that stage. Some of us see it. Just not all of us are brave enough yet." She read the note twice, then folded it again and slipped it into her pocket. It was the first note that didn't burn. 5th period passed without interruption. 6th dragged. 7th limped. As the final bell rang, she moved to the music room again, not to practice, not to play, but because she needed silence that didn't feel like punishment. Mr. Roman wasn't there, but the door was unlocked. She stepped inside, sat near the window, and watched the afternoon light grow thin. For several minutes, she didn't move. Then the door opened slowly. A student she recognized but didn't know stepped inside. He was tall, wore a black hoodie, didn't make eye contact. He didn't speak, just walked to the far cabinet, retrieved a folder, and turned to leave. But before he stepped out, he paused at the door, looked over his shoulder, and said quietly, "That wasn't funny." Then he left. She sat perfectly still, not sure what to do with the words. They weren't an apology. They weren't a defense. But they weren't cruelty either. They were proof of something else. A pulse. A shift. A crack in the wall. That evening, at home, she joined Daniel in the garage while he sorted tools. He offered her a screwdriver and a small wooden box, and she helped him tighten hinges in silence. After a while, he said, "You've been real quiet." She didn't look up. She said, "I'm paying attention." He nodded once, then went back to work. No more words passed between them, but she knew he understood. He always did. In her room that night, she didn't add anything new to the folder. The message didn't change her reality, but it shifted something in the way she stood. She wasn't seen yet, not fully, but someone had stopped looking through her. That alone made her spine stand straighter as she stepped into the gray morning, her backpack tighter against her shoulder, her shoes deliberate against the sidewalk. The day began without spectacle. No new notes, no fresh props in her locker. Students still avoided her, but no longer with the sharpness of performance. It felt like fatigue, like the momentum behind the cruelty had started to dull, not from guilt but exhaustion. The ugliness was no longer entertainment. It had become a habit losing its rhythm. Still, she didn't let her guard down. She moved through her classes with the same careful silence she had practiced all year, her eyes forward, her hand still. The whispering had faded, But in its place was something stranger. Stares that lingered longer than before, not with mockery, but with calculation, as if people were trying to reassess what they thought they knew. It wasn't kindness. It was confusion. And confusion, she knew, could turn ugly again without warning. During third period, Mr. Caldwell asked her to stay behind after class. She felt her chest tighten, unsure if this would be another soft attempt at dismissal. But when the room emptied, he walked over slowly and lowered his voice. "I heard what happened Friday," he said, "and I want you to know I reported the video." She blinked. He continued. "It wasn't just cruel. It was unauthorized." She didn't answer. She didn't nod. She just watched his eyes. They didn't hold guilt. They held discomfort, the kind that came from knowing he should have acted sooner. She said thank you and left the room before he could say more. It wasn't the apology she wanted, but it was the first time an adult had acknowledged anything had gone wrong. At lunch, she sat alone again, but this time, the table next to hers stayed empty even though other students were standing. She noticed that a few people glanced her way and then turned their heads quickly, as if looking at her made them complicit in something they didn't understand. That afternoon, during gym, she didn't change. She told Coach Bell she had cramps. He nodded without speaking, waved her toward the bleachers. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the other girls run laps. The noise of the gym echoed around her, sneakers squeaking, whistles blowing, voices bouncing off walls. But none of it touched her. She was somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Her body sat on those bleachers, but her mind was moving through time, rearranging memories. She thought about Daniel, not just about his quiet evenings or how he fixed things around the house, or how he never pushed her to explain the sadness behind her eyes. She thought about what he hadn't told her, the uniform he wore, the late hours, the way he always looked out the window before answering a knock on the door. The folder under her bed had names. It had images. But what it didn't have yet was context. That evening, after dinner, Marissa went to the hallway closet and pulled out the shoebox Daniel kept on the top shelf. It wasn't hidden, just old and taped to the corners. He always said it held his military keepsakes. She opened it slowly. Inside were medals, patches, a pair of folded letters, and beneath it all, a faded newspaper clipping with a photo of him standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. The headline read, "Local vet pulls children from burning apartment." Her breath caught. She unfolded the article. It was dated 9 years ago, before he married her mother. The story described how he had seen smoke from the street, broken through a window, and carried 2 unconscious children out before the fire department arrived. He had suffered burns on his back and arms, refused treatment until the paramedics confirmed both children were breathing. His name was spelled out clearly in the second paragraph. Staff Sergeant Daniel Warren, U.S. Army, retired. She read it 3 times. It didn't feel real. She had lived under his roof for years. She had seen his scars. But he had never once brought up the article, never told her the story, never even hinted at it. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the clipping back into the box, replaced the lid, and returned it to the shelf. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her room with the folder of torment on her lap and the weight of a hero's silence in her chest. The next day, she walked into school differently. Not louder, not angrier, but fuller. She didn't feel like a girl trying to survive anymore. She felt like someone holding a truth too heavy to keep tucked away. In first period, she sat at her desk and looked Mr. Barnett in the eye when he spoke. In third, she raised her hand before the question was finished. At lunch, she didn't take her usual spot. She sat near the center, pulled out her sandwich, and ate slowly, daring anyone to interrupt her. No one did. In seventh period, while others packed up their bags early, she stayed seated, watching the clock tick to the end. On her way out of the classroom, she passed the announcement board. Conversations had returned, but the tone had shifted. Her name was no longer spoken like a joke. It had become something less casual, something uncertain, maybe even something untouchable. She had not confronted anyone. She had not lashed out. But still, the balance had tipped. The whispers had thinned. The courage behind the cruelty had cracked. And today, that crack would split wide. Second period passed uneventfully. The teacher avoided eye contact but called on her twice. Students at nearby desks no longer shifted away. Third period brought another quiet nod from a classmate she didn't know well, a boy who had once snickered during a cruel joke, but now only glanced her way with guilt that he tried to disguise as indifference. She ignored it. By lunchtime, the sky outside had cleared and the cafeteria was full of the usual noise. Marissa sat at a center table again, unpacked her lunch with deliberate motions, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. A group of students from the debate team began arguing loudly over current events at the next table. One of them, Jason Crane, tall, polished, with a voice that always reached farther than it should, raised his hand for quiet. He smirked, glanced around the room, and said loud enough to cut across conversation, "Some people wouldn't know heroism if it mopped them in the face." His table erupted in laughter. Not everyone joined in. Some looked away. Some shook their heads. But the sound was enough. It hit like a match striking dry paper. Marissa stood up, slowly, not hurried, not nervous. She picked up her tray, walked across the room, and stopped right beside Jason's table. He looked up, still smiling, expecting her to walk past. She didn't. Her voice, when it came, was low but carried across the space like glass breaking. "You want to talk about heroes?" she asked, not loudly, but with so much clarity that even nearby conversations froze. Jason blinked. She continued. "Then say his name. Daniel Warren. Say the name of the man who dragged 2 kids out of a burning building, while half this town stood back and watched. Say the name of the soldier who served 2 tours, got wounded twice, and came home to clean your hallways without complaint. Say the name of the man you laugh at without knowing he's already done more than you ever will." Her words were measured, every syllable clean and sharp. Jason's smile faltered. The cafeteria was silent now, every head turned, every tray stilled. She reached into her backpack, pulled out the folded newspaper clipping, and placed it on the table in front of him. "You called him a janitor, but that's not all he is. And it's not all I am either." She turned, left the article behind, and walked away without looking back. The silence held for several seconds after she left. Then it broke, not with laughter, but with murmurs. Curious, uneasy, shifting murmurs. Students passed the article down the table. The photo of Daniel Warren, standing outside the burned apartment building, stared up at them from the page. His name in bold print. His story told with no embellishment. Just facts. Just courage. By the end of a lunch period, a photo of the clipping had made it onto a group chat. By the next class, it had spread further. She didn't know it, but 3 teachers had already read it. By the end of the day, the front office would receive 5 inquiries asking if the Daniel Warren in the article was the same man working in the maintenance wing. And when the answer came back yes, the reactions came quietly, but with weight. Teachers who had ignored her looked twice. Students who had once called her names stopped mid-sentence. Rumors changed shape. Laughter turned to questions. After 7th period, Marissa made her way to the music wing. She didn't go to sit in silence. She didn't go to be alone. She went because Mr. Roman had sent her a note asking her to stop by. When she arrived, he motioned for her to come in, then handed her a folder. Inside was a request form already approved, to use the auditorium for a presentation next week. At first, she didn't understand. Then he nodded. "It's yours," he said. "You should be the one who speaks." She didn't reply, just held the folder in her hands. The form was signed. The room was scheduled. The date was set. Her words had not been a call to arms, but something more powerful. A mirror held up to everyone who had looked past her for months and pretended not to see what was happening. The students who once led the whisper campaign now avoided eye contact entirely. The ones who had followed out of boredom or loyalty were quieter than ever, unsure how to measure their own guilt now that the target had a face and her family had a history they couldn't rewrite. By mid-morning, the weight of their silence began folding in on itself. Teachers who had once overlooked the tension in their classrooms started to notice every shift in posture, every turned shoulder, every pair of eyes that flicked too fast from one side of the room to the other. But the true unraveling began when the video club's advisor, Ms. Golding, called a meeting during third period and asked to have accessed the assembly footage to add the slideshow. No one confessed, but 2 students left the room pale and tight-lipped. Within an hour, Ms. Golding had reviewed the login history on the club's shared drive and found the edit timestamp. She cross-checked access permissions. The trail led directly to a student named Preston Wild, a senior, member of the video club, yearbook staff, and former homecoming court nominee, who had, until now, hidden his pettiness behind humor and charisma. When he was called to the office, he shrugged off the accusation, saying it was just a joke, no big deal. But Principal Ramy did not laugh. Nor did Ms. Ryland, who had seen the footage for herself and realized too late how many eyes had been trained on that screen, how many mouths had stayed shut when they should have opened. Preston was suspended on the spot, 3 weeks minimum, and removed from all extracurriculars. But the punishment didn't end with policy. The announcement spread by word of mouth, like a fire looking for dry wood. The students who had laughed loudest began fielding questions they didn't want to answer. Why hadn't they stopped him? Why had they thought it was funny? What did they think now? By lunch, 2 other students were caught scrubbing graffiti from the girls' bathroom, remnants of the jokes that had once been passed around like currency. They didn't complain. They didn't speak. They wiped each message with quiet, desperate focus. Meanwhile, Marissa walked through it all with steady silence. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She didn't offer forgiveness. That was never what she wanted. She sat through class as though nothing had changed, answered when called on, and offered no reaction when students whispered her name with new tones, part fear, part curiosity, part regret. During gym, Coach Bell pulled her aside, asked if she needed to speak with someone. She shook her head. After everything, she still didn't want pity. She wanted memory. She wanted them to remember what they had allowed, what they had built with their silence, what they had watched burn and said nothing to stop. The power was never about revenge. It was about permanence. And permanence, she knew now, came from truth carried like a blade, not swung, not thrown, just held with such calm that others had to see it. The full storm broke Friday afternoon. Marissa's name was called over the intercom near the end of 6th period. She was asked to report to the auditorium. She knew what it was for. Mr. Roman had sent her the finalized time earlier in the week. Her folder was already in her backpack. As she walked down the hallway, students watched her go, not with ridicule, not even with discomfort, but with awareness. They knew something was coming. When she stepped onto the stage, the lights were bright but not blinding. The first 2 rows were filled with students. More filed in behind them. A few teachers lingered near the side doors. No one forced them to be there. They came because something was shifting, and people watch most closely when a balance begins to tip. Marissa stood at the podium with the folder in front of her and a deep, controlled breath behind her ribs. She didn't open with a joke. She didn't start with an apology. She began with a name. Daniel Warren, she said, saved 2 children from a fire, served in the military, and now keeps the halls of this school safe and clean so none of you ever have to see what he's already seen. She let the words hang, then flipped the folder open. She pulled out each note, each flyer, each piece of evidence. Not to shame, to show, to name the pattern, to name the people who helped create the lie. But she didn't name them aloud. She let the proof speak. She read one quote after another, her voice even, her hands steady. The room remained silent, not the fragile silence of waiting for a punchline, but the silence of truth landing with weight. When she reached the final page, the Fake Spirit Week flyer, she held it up, looked across the crowd, and said, "This isn't about jokes. This isn't about thick skin. This is about how you decide who deserves to be laughed at and who deserves to be heard." She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood still long enough for her absence of fury to become its own message. When she finished, there was no applause. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because no one knew how to clap for what they had ignored. People left slowly, some with heads down, others with wet eyes. A few students stayed behind. One girl approached and whispered, "I'm sorry," then walked away before Marissa could reply. Another handed her a note with no name and left. When she opened it, it said only, "Thank you for showing us how far it went." In the hallway, after, the school counselor stood waiting. She asked if Marissa wanted to file anything formally. By the time Monday came, Kennedy Heights High School had changed in ways no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. It wasn't the kind of change you could capture in a photo or post in a newsletter. It moved quieter than that. It existed in the way people glanced at each other before speaking, in how a teacher hesitated before ignoring a raised hand, in how laughter now arrived slower, more thoughtful, stripped of the easy cruelty that had once passed without consequence. The assembly Marissa Hollins led the week before had not brought thunder or applause, but its silence had been louder than any standing ovation. It had made the school look at itself, and once people see clearly, pretending blindness becomes a burden. Marissa arrived that morning to a desk without scribbles, a locker unmarked, and a hallway that no longer hissed her name. But it wasn't peace she walked into. It was the beginning of an aftermath. Change does not come wrapped in victory. It comes with reckoning. And reckoning, she knew, meant deciding what kind of person you'd be after the damage is already done. Some students still avoided her. Some couldn't look her in the eye. A few tried too hard, offering awkward hellos or too loud compliments in the hope that a few kind words might erase months of silence. She accepted none of it with hostility, but with caution. Not every apology deserves acceptance. Some things take time to heal. Some things should remain scars, not because they define a person, but because they remind others not to repeat history. During lunch, she received 3 notes. One was anonymous and simply said, "I wish I'd stood up." Another was signed by Brittany Jensen, one of the girls who once called her names in gym, and read, "You changed what I thought I understood. I'm sorry. I hope to be better." The last was from a teacher. A short letter slipped discreetly into her folder, thanking her for her strength, for her truth, and admitting regret for not speaking up when she should have. Marissa read each one with the same stillness she had carried for weeks. Then she placed them all in the folder beneath her desk, not because she needed the praise, but because stories matter more when they are written down, preserved as proof of what people are capable of, both in cruelty and in courage. By Thursday, the school had launched a new initiative, one hastily constructed, but clearly built in response to what had happened. They called it the Visibility Project, a student-led effort to recognize the contributions of people in the community who were too often overlooked. Marissa was asked to be part of the planning committee. She declined. Instead, she nominated Daniel. She did not ask him first. When the committee asked why, she said only, "You can't fix what you ignore. Start by naming the ones you used to look past." On Friday, the front page of a school paper featured a photo of Daniel Warren, mop in hand, smiling awkwardly in front of the school's main stairwell. The article inside didn't glorify him. It told the truth. It told of his service, the fire rescue, his transition to custodial work, and how the measure of a man should never be based on who he serves, but how he serves. The article ended with a quote from Daniel himself, one Marissa had never heard him say. "You don't clean floors for applause. You clean them because people walk on them." That sentence alone spread through the halls like scripture. Students wrote it in notebooks. One teacher taped it above her whiteboard. Someone even printed it on the back of their hoodie. The man they once mocked now held more respect in that school than any principal ever had. But more important than the quotes or articles were the changes that didn't need banners. A new girl who transferred in from another state was introduced in homeroom without being dissected by whispers. A younger student who dropped her lunch in the cafeteria was helped by 3 others, none of whom had spoken to her before. A boy who had once snickered during the janitor jokes asked Mr. Roman if he could volunteer to clean up after the next school concert. And in the quietest corner of the school, the old janitor's closet that had once been turned into a joke now held a small plaque on the outside. It read, "Respect begins where judgment ends." No one took credit for hanging it, but everyone saw it, and that was enough. Marissa still walked the halls quietly. She didn't change her posture or start dressing louder. She didn't run for student government or stand at podiums. She let her presence speak. She let her consistency become her power. The folder that once held every insult now held every note of change, every acknowledgement, every mark of slow repair. She did not forget what they had done, but she also didn't let it define her. Because real justice, she had learned, doesn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it arrives in the small hands of those who decide to be better than the ones who came before them. Sometimes justice is watching the ones who hurt you build something new, not because you asked them to, but because they saw who they were and chose not to stay that way. On the last day of the semester, Marissa stayed after school. Not for detention, not for music, just to sweep the back hallway where students often left muddy tracks. She wasn't asked to. She just did it. Daniel found her there, broom in hand, the sunlight catching her face through the tall windows. He stood for a while without speaking. Then he said, "You didn't have to do that." She turned, looked at him, and said, "Neither did you. But you did anyway." He nodded once, smiling with that quiet understanding that never needed words. They stood there together, father and daughter, not by blood but by choice, surrounded by silence that felt not like punishment, but peace. It wasn't victory they stood in. It was dignity, unshaken. The end. If this story moved you or made you think, take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps support more content like this. I'd love to know your thoughts. What did you think of the plot? Which part hit the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Let's talk.